Okay, everybody, I'll go ahead and get started. My name's Tracie McKinney. I'm a senior lecturer in biological anthropology at the University of South Wales. I've been invited to talk to you today about women in primatology, which is my field, which is good fun. I'm going to aim for kind of about half an hour for this little chat. Please feel free to use the group chat there if you want to. And then we should have a few minutes for question and discussion if we want afterwards. Zoom will kick us off after 40 minutes, I think, but we should be good. Okay. Okay, so just a quick outline so you know there is a plan. So first I'll just mention what primatology is for anyone who may not know. I'll talk a little bit about my path into primatology and my research. And then we're going to focus on women in primatology for a little while. And then just to wrap it up a little bit, we can see if we get some lessons from our monkeys. Okay. All right, first thing, what is primatology? What does this actually mean? Primatology is the study of non-human primates. People are primates, but all the other guys who are not people are who primatologists focus on. That's about 600 species and subspecies. So it includes the monkeys, the apes, the lemurs, and all their other little fuzzy weird relatives. There's a lot of really cute things to explore here and a lot of great questions that we can look at. Anthropology is a very interdisciplinary science. It's very specific in its taxonomic focus. There's not a lot of other studies you can do that just looks at one order of animals. But the disciplinary paths into anthropology are pretty diverse compared to into primatology are diverse compared to some other studies. So people may start out as anthropologists, as psychologists, as ecologists, as conservationists, and all end up working with a research focus on the non-human primates. So there's a pretty huge range of study topics here then. We can look at primates for their own sake, primates because they're interesting. So people who do that often study primate behavior, primate ecology, conservation, things like cognition and social interaction. And then we could also look at primates because they're linked to our own evolution. They're our closest living relatives. We have shared ancestry with other primates, so we can look at them to study our own evolution. They're great models for medical research or for human cognition, human psychology, that sort of thing. So there are a billion questions you can ask within primatology and loads of different species we can look at. Okay, a little bit about me and how I landed here. I am not from an academic background. I am a country girl. I grew up in Southern West Virginia. I'm a first generation graduate. My mom has graduated too, but I beat her to it. So I'm a first generation university graduate. So to land in a kind of not very practical, kind of a quite academic field like anthropology was a little bit of a surprise, I think, for a lot of folks. So I started university with the plan to become a veterinarian and hope to work with wildlife, basically. I never even heard of anthropology when I started university. But pre-veterinary medicine is very much like pre-med. It's super competitive. There's a lot of hard math. I didn't really quite enjoy that. But in the US system, students take general ed requirements. So science students have to take humanities and literature and things like that. Humanities students have to take a bit of science, that sort of thing. So anthropology was one of my just general ed things that I picked up because it sounded kind of cool. And it turned out to be amazing and I loved it. So I changed majors and was on my path toward anthropology and then later primatology. A really cool thing in hindsight, because I'm thinking a bit about representation in science today, is now I look back and my tiny university at the time had 2 lecturers who taught introductory anthropology. And one was quite a solid, very good lecturer. And the other one is absolutely bonkers. And I had the bonkers person later on, but I wonder if I'd had the bonkers person for my introductory class, if I ever would have ended up in anthropology and if I ever would have ended up in primatology. So tiny little things like engaging with a lecturer can mean so much in somebody's career path. So found anthropology by accident, really, but I loved it and that's where I went. So after undergrad, I spent a year working for the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, because I thought, well, if I'm going to study primates, I better make sure I actually like them and get some experience around them. That year was enlightening because I learned I did love primates, but I learned I did not love lab work. Lab work's not for me. So I spent a year there and then went back into school, and I did my master's and PhD at The Ohio State University. Grad school's amazing. I spent all my time thinking about evolution and monkeys and nerdy things like that. I had some really interesting and intelligent friends. And then I ended up spending nearly 2 years in Costa Rica doing data collection. So field research there in Costa Rica was funded by the university itself, but also Primate Conservation and Earthwatch Institute. And if you're familiar with Earthwatch, they're a citizen science organization. So that also means I got a little bit of science communication and field teaching experience along the way, because I have volunteers come in, people with no experience who just liked animals, to come in and learn. Okay, so I'm a lucky girl. My dissertation work was all collected here. This is Refugio de Vida Silvestre Caru in Costa Rica. My little cabin that I lived in was just an inch or so off the screen, into those trees on the beach there. So dissertation work here at this beautiful place, and with these little guys. Not these guys, well, I mean, it is these guys personally. The one on the left is Papa Congo, the one on the right is Simon. But they're there to represent their species. I had 4 study groups of these 2 species here. The left one is a mantled howler monkey. The right is a white-faced capuchin monkey. So this was my research, stomping around in the woods for a couple of years, chasing these guys. So that leads us into actual research. Most of my outputs then grew directly from my dissertation. There's the title, Social and Ecological Impact of Anthropogenic Disturbance on the Sympatric White-Faced Capuchin and the Mantled Howler Monkey. Anthropogenic means human origin, right? So human cause disturbance. Sympatric just means those 2 species live in the same place. So my original doctoral work was looking at how humans and animals interact, and basically looking at the effects of human tourism, crop foraging, having plantations around, human interactions, that sort of thing, on these 2 species of neotropical primates. So most of the research I've done since then has built off of this. I've always worked in this theme of human-animal interaction. So so I've published from dissertation work on the ecological flexibility of howler monkeys. I've published on the effects of provisioning, so people feeding the animals, on foraging behavior of capuchin monkeys. I've published on species-specific responses amongst these animals. I've not had much field time since then, and that's something we'll talk about more here in a little bit. So since my dissertation, a lot of my research has been more methods and review-based work rather than field-based work. So some other things I've done here. I've done some work on how we can consistently report human-based disturbances across all these animals. Remember, I said we've got hundreds of species, we've got thousands of study sites, there's loads of data, but there's a lot of individual variation at those sites and with those species. So we need a consistent way to report these things and allow us to have meta-analyses on these factors. So that's some things I've been working on. Some other areas of research I've done in the last 10 years or so. I've done some work on ethnoprimatology, which is a subset of primate research that looks at human, non-human interactions specifically. This grows from the field of anthropology, and it uses it means there's an interest in human cultures and human behaviors, and it uses some methodology from cultural anthropology as well. I've written on ecotourism, so tourism that involves nature and wildlife and how that might affect the animals, specifically tourism with primates. And I've also written a little bit on the use of the term commensalism. So commensalism usually means in biology that we've got 2 organisms that live together. One may benefit from the other, but the other one is not affected. And we often use the word commensalism to talk about primates living in farms or living in cities, but but it's not often used correctly. So we've done some writing on that as well. Finally, just a weird little project here. It's been great fun though. I've been working with an archaeologist and some other colleagues within primatology to identify these guys. These are the blue monkeys of Akrotiri. There's a series of paintings that date to the Bronze Age in Crete. They've been historically identified as vervet monkeys, which live in Africa. But we actually, we put our heads together and we actually think they're langurs, and langurs are from the Indus Valley. So if our interpretation is correct, and it's probably correct because it's a bunch of primatologists and a taxonomic illustrator who put this idea together, this has big implications for trade and travel networks during this time frame. So it has archaeological influence. Okay, so that's my research. To look back at field work for a minute, here's kind of a typical day working in the field in the tropics. There's my little cabin. This was the good cabin. There are several cabins there. So there's no hot water or electricity there, but it's a nice little house. We've got 2 hammocks. It's all good. So here's our little cabin. You get up before the sun, pack up your supplies today, and then you head out, walk to where you're most likely to pick up your study group. So at this site in Costa Rica, this involved tromping across some cattle fields and things like that, and then up into the mountains. Once you're there, you go to wherever you'll find your animals. Depends on the species I was working with, really. Capuchins have preferred sleeping areas. Howlers go to bed wherever they happen to be, so you pick them up where you saw them the day before. And then you walk or you listen until you find your animals. This is what they might look like, if you're lucky. And sometimes you get a little bit closer. This picture is probably right before I got up and moved, because that's a little closer than comfortable generally, but they were moving toward me rather than the other way around. So anyway, some days you don't find them at all, and that's okay. It's super frustrating, but honestly, it's not a bad way to spend your day, sitting on a log in the forest, miles from anybody, maybe reading a trashy novel, whatever. It's not a bad failure as far as days go. But anyway, so we'll be out in the woods. You work until dusk because it gets dark quick in the woods, and then start the walk back home for dinner, tidying up your data, and getting ready for the next day. Okay, nowadays I work as a course leader and a senior lecturer, so the scenery is a little less idyllic, but I still get to teach anthropology, primatology, I teach human evolution, I teach growth and development. It's all really exciting, interesting stuff, and I have a great time. All right, I also get to enjoy a little bit of science communication activity. I don't do loads of this, I'm still learning. Somebody's mic on there, getting a little feedback. But we've got some science communication activities there, like Soapbox Science, that's in Cardiff a couple of years. I've written for The Conversation a couple of times, so that's a little more kind of public research. Okay. All right, so let's move to the meat of this here a little bit and talk about women specifically in primatology. Primatology is kind of interesting for this question because sometimes it's held up as an equal opportunity discipline. It's kind of the shining light in parity among scientific disciplines. So I want to know, is that true? Is it really quite equal opportunity? This trend was noted back quite a while ago, back in the early 90s, when Linda Fettigan reported that 38% of primatologists were female at the time, and that was higher than most scholarly organizations and groups. A more recent study, the study's from 2012, but the data are 2008, puts women at 57% of primatologists. I don't have any more recent data, but by all informal appearances, this trend has continued. If you look at the student body of primate groups, or primate courses, or conference attendance, it's very female dominant. So the question there is, why is this? Why might women gravitate toward the study of primates? I've got 2 possible explanations. One's a little more inspiring than the other, but we'll have a look. Probably the biggest explanation are these ladies here, sometimes known as the Trimates. So in the 1950s, a very prominent paleoanthropologist called Leaky went specifically looking for people to study the great apes, so the gorillas, the chimpanzees, and the orangutans. He left the bonobos out, they kind of came later. But he wanted to know more about great apes because he was interested in human evolution. And while we didn't evolve from chimpanzees, they are kind of our closest relatives. So the more we can know about these apes and their behavior, the more we can know about ourselves, is the idea. So Leaky found and trained and sponsored these 3 women. The most famous here in the middle is Jane Goodall, who began her work with chimpanzees at Gombe in 1960, and she's still a tireless advocate for chimpanzees and for wildlife conservation in general. So still very hardworking. On the left, there's Diane Fossey, who was made famous by the film Gorillas in the Mist. She worked with mountain gorillas and is instrumental in bringing them from the brink of extinction, really. She started there in 1967 and worked there until she was murdered, actually, in the field in 1985. And then on the right is Bairuti Galdikas, who started field work with orangutans in 1971. And she still is a professor. She runs a rescue center. She's still very active in orangutan research and conservation. So these women are really, really fascinating because we've got a couple of things going on here. They were chosen in part through some pretty serious gender stereotypes, actually. Louis Leakey believed that he had to send women for this job. He thought that women were better observers of animal behavior because he thought women were more patient, were more empathetic, were less likely to be viewed as a threat by the animals and by the local people who live there. And he just thought women were the right people to do this. So that's a little bit interesting. We've also got a little bit of a colonialist approach going here too, because Leakey chose his people from white Western scholars when they're perfectly capable local people who could have done this work. So there are a couple little issues here, but there's still an excellent example of how important representation is in the sciences. When we ask why there are so many women in primatology, this is what usually comes up. The Trimates, jokingly sometimes called Leakey's angels. But when you talk to primatologists, almost all lady primatologists will say something about, I grew up reading about Jane Goodall, or I grew up reading about Diane Fossey, whatever. And you can imagine how amazing it is for little girls to see these fearless women having these adventures that were usually reserved for men on the pages of National Geographic. So they're in the forest, there's these magnificent animals, they're far away from the comforts of home, and that's really, really inspiring. Okay. There's a slightly less exciting interpretation for why there's so many women in primatology. And this is, as I said before, primatology is fed by a number of disciplines. And most of the disciplines that feed primatology are also things that have high participation of women. So anthropology is heavily female. Psychology has a lot of women. Animal behavior has a lot of women. So some have argued that the number of women in primatology is not actually statistically significantly different from these other fields. So the idea that primatology is especially women-friendly science might actually just be a little bit over-exaggerated because of that nice story of Jane Goodall. Okay, whatever the case, we've got a lot of ladies. So let's look at some issues. So what issues disproportionately affect women in primatology? I'm going to start with my biggest personal hurdle, which is childcare. I fully recognize that not all women have children or want children, and also that there are a lot of men who are primary caretakers. But I think we'd agree that childcare is an issue that disproportionately affects women. Okay. So the biggest issue is generally field work. Non-human primates live in rural areas, typically in tropical countries. So for Western scholars, that means some pretty major travel. And there's extra complications when you have little ones in tow. Funders also generally do not cover childcare expenses. There are a few that consider that, but this is an additional cost if you want to bring your kids and a carer with you. Your other option is to leave kids back home and go without them, which some people can do better than others. I've had one trip without my little one. I spent 2 weeks in the field when she was about 6, and it was very, very hard, even though I knew she was perfectly safe and healthy back home. So this is a little bit of a concern. I did have a go at taking my kid to the field once. She was just under 2, so that's Ren, not looking like she's having a very good time right there. I did take her to Costa Rica for about a month when she was just under 2 and still nursing. We were only able to do this because my partner happened to have field experience and could take this time off of work himself. So he had the baby half the day and I was in the field half the day, then we'd swap, that sort of thing. Honestly, it was not a very successful field season. It was very, very stressful. We did not collect as much data as we normally would have in that amount of time, and it was hard. So she's 8.5 now. She knows way more about primates than a normal 8-year-old. But I think I only have one child. I have a partner. If you have more children, that extends the period of time you're limiting. If you're a single parent, that would be very difficult. So, and I have no statistics for this, but a lot of the female scholars that I really admire and who are the most prolific are also people who often don't have children. So while I wouldn't trade her for a whole barrel of monkeys, this is a significant challenge for career progression because it tends to fall in your early career, and it does have a big impact. Okay, a couple other issues that affect women disproportionately. Let's talk a bit about safety. So this applies to any field research, but because field research is big in primatology, it's important and it's key. So there was a study, it's known as the SAFE 13 study, but it's the survey of academic field experience. So this study by Clancy and colleagues surveyed over 600 field scientists, both male and female. They found that female trainees were more likely to be targeted in the field, and the perpetrators of that were usually people they worked with, their senior scholars, not local folks. They're usually people that came with them. The study found that 70% of female respondents had personally experienced sexual harassment in the field. 26% of female respondents have been sexually assaulted in the field. And both men and women, most respondents don't know how to report problems. If they do report problems, most had an unsatisfactory outcome. This is something that we've known informally for many years. People talk amongst themselves. They say, oh, don't work with this person, they're creepy, whatever. But now we've got some data to show just how big an issue this is for safety in the field. Okay, one more big one, glass ceilings and leaky pipelines. Okay, so despite the prevalence of women in primatology and the pleasure we have of having a lot of female role models, because we really do, we've got some amazing female scholar role models here, we still have glass ceiling issues and leaky pipelines. If you're not familiar with the leaky pipeline terminology, here's a nice little diagram. The idea is that the further you go through the academic progression or through any kind of career really, but the further you go, you disproportionately lose women at every stage. So in this graphic here from Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, you can see women are less likely to be employed as grad students or postdocs. They're less likely to get excellent recommendation letters. Their startups are lower. Women submit fewer grants. Women win fewer awards. And so at every little stage, women kind of start to trickle out. So with primatology, we've got piles of undergraduate primatology women, decent, quite a lot at lecture and senior lecture level. But the further you go, as you get into reader and prof, and the representation of women declines. Here's a nice example of this. A good example is who's seen as an influential scholar within the field. The PSGB is the Primate Society of Great Britain. It's a fantastic organization that I'm involved with, and it has high female involvement and representation of women all the way up to the level of president, but we still see a disparity in award winners. The PSGB gives a memorial medal for a distinguished primatologist every 2 years or so. This medal's been awarded since 1978. And in that 42 year span, there have been 4 female winners, so that's 17% of awardees, which is a little bit surprising considering we've got a field where roughly 60% are women. When I moan about women in science to colleagues, I have heard many people say that this idea of a glass ceiling is a holdover of lower representation of women in the past. So that as more women enter the field, that glass ceiling will start to crack and we won't see this disproportionate representation. But remember, we said that women were 40% of all primatologists back in the early 90s. That was 30 years ago, so we've had plenty of time for those women to advance through the ranks of academia, and we are still losing them a bit. Sorry, I've got 10 minutes. I'm okay. All right, so yeah, women are, even in a field like primatology where we have loads and loads of women, we do become less represented higher up in the field. All right, finally, and kind of quickly, I want to highlight some other issues of equality within primatology. I'm speaking today about women's issues because this is the Wales Women in STEM Network, and also because this is something I can speak about from my lived experience. But we're not just women, we have other identities and other intersections, and we need to think about other marginalized communities. So just a couple quick things to keep you thinking. For the LGBT plus community, there is an issue of safety. There are a number of primate habitat countries where homosexuality is literally illegal. So different cultural attitudes and different laws can put people at risk, or at least make people, if they work in those field sites, they're unable to be their full authentic selves and they may not feel safe. So this is something we need to keep in mind, especially when planning, say, field schools for students. We need to make sure that everybody is welcome and everybody is safe. Disability issues. The emphasis on fieldwork in primatology can be very ableist in a way, really. Not everyone can fly halfway around the world and chase a monkey up a hill every day. That's, that doesn't mean that people can't make meaningful contributions to primatology. There's all kinds of amazing work that can be done in zoos or in labs or theoretical work or in museum collections. So I think we might need to tone down the emphasis on field work to make sure we're involving everyone. And finally, primatology, along with its parent disciplines, especially anthropology, have a history of what we call parachute science, where Western scholars kind of swoop in and collect their data and swoop back out again. I'm guilty of this myself because, I mean, when I was trained, I didn't know any better as a graduate student. That's just what we did. This is something we need to address, though. We can address it by engaging more with local communities, by collaborating more with host country scholars, by training local students, and really embracing a global idea of primatology. Okay. So my general impression of primatology is that it's pretty sweet, but like everything, there is room for improvement. We can make primatology better for everybody. So just to wrap up, let me have a quick look at some lessons from the monkeys. All right, monkey lesson number 1, be curious. This is Sammy, she's having some dog food for lunch. But science is all about curiosity. And I think this is one of the greatest traits we share with our non-human primate relatives, because we're all just intensely curious. Having women in science having women in primatology specifically has changed the whole game because women ask different questions. Women have different perspectives than men. The more diverse our science is, the more viewpoints get explored and the more questions get asked, and that can only be a positive thing. Monkey lesson number 2. This be tenacious. This little monkey's Anna, and she always hated me, and I don't know why. She just always did. So keep fighting. Being a scholar is really hard, and it's hard for everybody. Being a woman in science brings some additional challenges, but we are making some progress. So I encourage everyone to keep fighting that good fight. If you are now in a cushy faculty position, be careful to not fall into that excuse of, well, it was hard for me, so it should be hard for them too. It's our job to make sure the path gets easier for the people who come behind us. So be tenacious, be a stubborn little monkey, and keep fighting. And finally, take care of your people. Just like all the primates, we are social creatures. That doesn't mean just our family and friends. That extends to our colleagues and our community. So be generous with your time and be generous with your scholarship and your support for each other. Primates are excellent at cooperation. so we can work together to do some really great science. And that's it for me. So thank you very much. I've got 5 minutes left, it tells me, if anybody has questions or discussion.